You think you had it rough as a kid. Waking up early for school, forgetting your lunch, maybe a scraped knee from soccer practice. Now imagine this. You're 8 years old. You're already hunting small animals, barefoot. You're learning to track predators, not from books, but from your father's scars. There's no birthday party, no cartoons, no bubble-wrapped safety net. Because out here, one mistake can get you, and your whole clan killed. Ancient children weren't just miniature humans waiting to grow up. They were survival assets, fighters, carriers of culture. And by the age you were begging for Wi-Fi, they were carrying fire across dangerous terrain. So how did kids thousands of years ago become tougher mentally and physically than most adults today? Let's go back in time and meet the children of the ancient world. Let's set the scene. It's 40,000 years ago. You're not sitting in a cozy house with Wi-Fi and cereal. You're a child wrapped in the hide of an animal your parents killed, if you're lucky. The wind howls through a frozen valley. Snow crunches beneath your feet, and the nearest sign of civilization is a fire pit carved into the dirt, surrounded by your tribe, who are already running low on meat. In the Ice Age, children weren't coddled. They were tested from birth. No toys, no diapers, no child-proofing. You learned to crawl on rough stone floors. You took your first steps, surrounded by sharp tools and open flames. Your pacifier, a bone. Your playground, a world trying to kill you. By age 3, you were learning to carry small bundles of wood or bones. By 5, you were expected to fetch water, help tan hides, watch for predators, and stay absolutely silent when your parents hunted. Because the stakes were higher than just discipline. If you cried at the wrong time, you didn't just annoy your parents, you risked alerting a wolf pack. And if you wandered too far, you didn't get a timeout. You vanished. This wasn't cruelty. It was survival. And for Ice Age humans, especially the early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, children were part of the system. You were expected to contribute. You were part of the hunt, the warmth, the memory of the group. And here's what makes it even harder to imagine. The average life expectancy. Maybe 30, maybe less. So if you were going to survive or make a difference, you had to grow up fast. In this world, childhood wasn't a phase. It was a proving ground. And if you couldn't prove yourself, you didn't make it to adulthood. If you think childhood was all work, think again. There was play. But it was Mario Kart or Fortnite. It was throwing stones at small animals to practice hunting. It was wrestling other kids to toughen up. It was pretending to track deer, and sometimes actually tracking deer. In the Ice Age, play was training, because there was no real distinction between learning and living. Neanderthal kids, for instance, were built sturdy. Thicker bones, muscular frames, and strong grips, even as children. But strength wasn't enough. You needed skills, which meant you learned by watching and by imitating. A child might quietly sit next to their father, watching him carve a flint blade for hours. Then try to mimic it using broken shards. There were no tutorials, no step-by-step guidance. Only trial and error, and if you failed, you bled. Anthropologists have even found child-sized tools buried with young remains. Tiny scrapers, miniature spears. Not toys, real tools made for little hands, designed to work. Because these kids weren't being prepared for adulthood someday. They were expected to survive now. And let's talk about danger. Everything was dangerous. Fire, animals, water, the cold. But perhaps most terrifying of all, other humans. Tribal conflict wasn't uncommon. If another group wandered too close, especially in harsh winters, things could turn violent fast. So children had to be alert. You weren't protected from harsh realities, you lived through them. Some cave sites even suggest that kids participated in group migrations, which meant days, even weeks, of walking on foot through ice and wind with no shoes, no shelter, and no idea what was coming next. And if a child couldn't keep up, they were left behind, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. That was the world they were born into. And somehow, some of them made it. In the Ice Age, there wasn't a clear coming-of-age moment with cake and candles. There were no sweet 16s. You didn't get a driver's license. You got responsibility. Real life-or-death responsibility. And usually, you got it early. By the age of 6 or 7, kids were already gathering food, hauling water, or helping prep animal hides. Some were hunting small game, not as practice, but for real survival. And if the tribe was attacked or starving, there was no age exemption. Everyone fought, everyone fled, everyone endured. In many hunter-gatherer societies, childhood, as we think of it, didn't exist. There was no buffer zone, no protected bubble of cartoons, sippy cups, and nap time. The moment you could walk, you followed the group. The moment you could carry weight, you did. And perhaps most intense, you were treated like an adult emotionally. That meant no coddling, no sugarcoating. If a sibling died in the cold, you buried them. If you messed up a task, you didn't get a scolding, you got a scar. And it wasn't out of harshness. It was just reality. The tribes that raised soft children didn't survive. The ones that raised sharp-eyed, quick-learning, emotionally resilient little humans. They carried the torch of humanity forward. Think about that. Your ancestors, the ones whose blood is still in your veins, had kids that hunted mammoths, buried parents, crossed frozen rivers barefoot, and kept going. Because in that world, surviving another day was your graduation. No medals, just breath in your lungs and fire in your gut. So the next time you hear someone say, "They don't make kids like they used to," just know, they're absolutely right. If Ice Age kids were forged by nature, ancient civilization kids were forged by culture, and sometimes it was even more brutal. Imagine being born in ancient Mesopotamia. You don't get a lullaby, you get a task list. You're not cuddled under soft blankets, you're swaddled in expectations. Your parents don't dream of you being happy, they dream of you being useful. By the age of 4 or 5, children were already miniature workers. In Sumer, that meant helping in the fields, carrying water jars taller than your chest, or kneading clay into bricks beside your father. If your family was rich, you weren't spared, you were trained. Elite children in Babylon might spend hours learning cuneiform. That's wedge-shaped writing on clay tablets, carved with a stylus until your fingers ached. And if you messed up a symbol, there was no "oops, good try." There was a reed stick. Corporal punishment was standard in education, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. To survive and uphold the God's will, you had to be disciplined. Because in these early societies, everything, food, health, protection, was on a knife's edge. Floods could ruin the harvest. A broken water jar might mean days without irrigation. One mistake could ripple through the entire village. So children weren't just playing with wooden toys, they were absorbing roles. Daughters watched mothers weave, grind grain, and cook for a dozen. Sons watched fathers till fish and fight off invaders. You didn't ask, "What do I want to be when I grow up?" You already were becoming it every single day. And don't think ancient civilization meant safety. Disease was everywhere. Sanitation was rough. Death was close enough to name. But somehow, through grit and ritual and relentless adaptation, they grew up. Not into YouTubers or influencers, but into scribes, warriors, priests, potters. The literal hands that built the world. So, what did a regular Tuesday look like for an ancient kid in the cradle of civilization? Let's drop you into Ur, one of the first cities in history. Brick buildings, narrow alleys, temples looming overhead. You're about 7 years old. Your father's a potter. Your mother's making beer from fermented grain mash. You're running to Edubba, the tablet house, one of the earliest schools ever recorded. Sounds impressive, right? Until you realize this school has no recess, no colored pencils, and no one's bringing you cupcakes on your birthday. Instead, your day starts with clay. You carry a heavy lump to your wooden desk and begin pressing out cuneiform characters, hundreds of them, each with its own rules and marks. Mess one up, do it again. Forget your lines. The teacher's reed switch says hello. Discipline was considered mercy, a way to shape not just your handwriting, but your soul. And only the luckiest kids got that. Most didn't go to school at all. Instead, they worked. Children in ancient Egypt, for example, were part of the workforce by age 6. You might be herding goats under the blistering sun, or apprenticing in trades like basket weaving, fishing, or boat making. Girls. From a young age, you were expected to help manage the home, a job that meant cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and religious rituals, all while avoiding the dangers of disease, childbirth, or social disgrace. But here's the wild part. Despite the workload, many of these kids were proud. Being entrusted with adult responsibilities meant you were seen, you mattered. You weren't a kid in the modern sense. You were just a smaller adult, and your role kept the entire community standing. They didn't have a word for childhood the way we do now. No protected stage of cartoons and carefree afternoons. You were born into a system, and the system expected things from you. So yeah, your 8 a.m. Zoom class might feel hard. But back then, that was the age of fire, and every child had to carry their own spark or risk fading into the shadows. Let's get one thing straight. Ancient kids weren't just helpers or students. Some of them were soldiers. Some were sacrifices. And some were raised to become gods. In ancient Sparta, for example, boys were taken from their families at just 7 years old and placed in military barracks. No goodbyes, no see you after school. Just thrown into the agoge, a brutal training system designed to harden them into warriors. You slept on reeds. You fought each other for food. You were taught how to kill, not in theory, but in practice. And if you showed weakness, it wasn't corrected, it was punished. Even outside of Sparta, childhood was anything but soft. In Aztec culture, children were expected to fast, carry heavy loads, and follow a strict moral code enforced with public shamming and even light bloodletting. Some were chosen as temple attendants, not for spiritual peace, but because their families believed it would earn them favor with the gods. These children might rise to high status or be ritually sacrificed. It wasn't cruel by their standards. It was sacred. In ancient China, noble children were burdened with a different kind of weight, legacy. You weren't trained to survive the wild. You were trained to maintain honor, to uphold the family name, to study Confucian texts until your eyes burned. Respect, obedience, and endurance weren't optional. They were your identity. And here's a haunting truth. In many ancient societies, infant mortality was devastatingly high. Sometimes, only half of all children survived to adulthood. So every breath a child took was a defiance of fate, every step forward, a triumph over nature and chance. Which means if you lived long enough to be tough, smart, or useful, you were already exceptional. These kids weren't just raised by fire. They were tempered by it, bent, beaten, and reforged into the foundations of civilization. So next time you hesitate over a cold shower or late-night homework, remember, somewhere in the past, a 10-year-old was fighting wolves, carrying bricks, or memorizing prayers that held their entire city together. By the time you were 6 years old in medieval Europe, your childhood was officially over. Forget recess, forget cartoons. You had animals to feed, fields to plow, and wood to chop, all before sundown. If you were born into a peasant family, which most people were, you were introduced to hard physical labor almost as soon as you could walk. You carried buckets, tended to goats, and followed your parents into the fields, not for fun, but for survival. And here's the wild part. Children weren't seen as special or in need of protection. They were seen as tiny adults with developing muscles. There were no parenting books, no psychology, no bedtime stories about kindness and empathy. Instead, you learned by watching. You learned by doing. And if you failed, there were no second chances, just consequences. Your clothes were made of scratchy wool. Your shoes, if you had any, were wooden. And your meals consisted of gruel, cabbage, and maybe stale bread. Protein was a luxury. Clean water, a gamble. You probably shared a bed with your siblings. You probably shared a room with your animals. And you most certainly shared responsibility for keeping your family alive. Now imagine doing all this with 0 vaccinations, no antibiotics, and winters so cold your fingers cracked and bled. A simple infection could kill you. So could bad grain, or a rat bite, or a fever. And yet some kids thrived. They learned to handle oxen, mend tools, and even barter at local markets. By the time they were 10, they knew more about seasonal planting and survival strategy than many modern adults do today. Their strength wasn't just physical, it was mental. They didn't whine, they didn't wait. They endured. Because if you didn't help, you were a burden, and no one could afford one. Let's say you were lucky. You weren't a peasant. Maybe your family lived in a bustling medieval town. Maybe your parents weren't farmers. They were blacksmiths, merchants, or carpenters. Congrats. You still didn't get a childhood. By age 7 or 8, your life path was already carved in stone. You were sent off as an apprentice. No more home, no more play. You lived with a master craftsman, worked under him, obeyed his rules, and spent the next 7 to 10 years learning a trade. This wasn't like today's internships. There was no stipend, no lunch breaks, and definitely no bring your kid to work day. You were the kid, and you were the one fetching water, scrubbing floors, chopping wood, or pumping bellows, all while trying to memorize every movement your master made. Some apprentices learned to carve intricate wooden beams, others to shape iron into weapons. And if you got something wrong, you didn't just get a lecture, you got smacked. Hard, sometimes with a stick. Discipline was physical. Respect was non-negotiable. But here's the thing. If you made it through, you earned something powerful, independence. By the time you were 16 or 17, you might become a journeyman, traveling between towns with your toolkit and a satchel. You earned wages, built a reputation, and maybe, just maybe, applied to a guild. The medieval guilds were like elite clubs for artisans. They protected trade secrets, set quality standards, and only let in the best. This meant your childhood had a deadline. You weren't just expected to grow up fast. You had to prove your worth to society by your teens. No exams, no college essays. Just raw skill and grit. Your success didn't depend on grades. It depended on whether you could hold a hammer, stitch a seam, or light a forge. And if you could, there was always the gutter, or worse, the battlefield. If you were a child in the medieval world, fear was a constant companion. Not fear of being grounded or losing screen time. Fear of dying, fear of your family vanishing overnight. Fear of being conscripted into war, or worse, left completely alone. Because the Middle Ages were brutal. Plagues tore through towns like wildfires. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. If it hit your village, you didn't ask if you'd lose someone. You asked how many. Mothers buried infants. Children buried parents. And by the time you were 10, you probably understood grief more deeply than most adults today. War was always nearby. Nobles fought nobles. Kings invaded other kings. Mercenaries raided villages for food, silver, and slaves. And boys. They were recruited as squires by 12 or 13. You cleaned your knight's armor, fed his horses, and watched him kill. Sometimes you joined the killing at 14, 15, sometimes earlier. And what about emotional support? There was no therapy. No, how do you feel about that? You didn't get a hug. You got a wooden sword and were told to toughen up, fast. But here's the twist. These kids, hardened by loss, labor, and war, weren't hollow. They loved fiercely. They helped raise younger siblings. They developed loyalty, faith, and a sense of purpose early. Because when you don't know how long you'll live, you grow up fast, and you live fully. So next time you think of medieval childhood as some dark blur of pain, remember this. It was dark, but it forged kids into people who could survive anything. They weren't soft. They were resilient. And maybe, just maybe, we could use a little of that strength today. So were ancient kids really tougher than us? By every measure, yes. They faced death, disease, hard labor, and war before they hit puberty. They didn't have the luxury of choosing hobbies or skipping school. They were hauling water, herding animals, caring for siblings, and learning to survive, not for fun, but because no one else would do it for them. But here's the thing. They weren't superhuman. They weren't born with iron wills or magical immune systems. They were just kids. Kids who adapted to a brutal world. Kids who did what they had to do every single day because the alternative was worse. And maybe in their struggles, there's something we've lost. Resilience, community, perspective. Not everything they went through was admirable. No one should bury 5 siblings before they turn 10. But their strength, that deserves to be remembered. Maybe we've gotten softer, or maybe we've just changed what survival means. But one thing for sure, if you ever feel like life's a little too much, remember the barefoot child with frostbitten toes, herding sheep across a frozen valley, dreaming of firelight and a meal that wouldn't come. They made it. And so will you. If this story made you think, or gave you a new appreciation for what came before, hit that subscribe button. We've got more forgotten truths, strange histories, and human stories coming every single week. Leave a comment below. Could you have survived as a prehistoric kid? We'll be reading your thoughts. And as always, thanks for wandering through the past with us. See you in the next story. Stay curious, stay strong. This is Forgotten Fires.